Okay. Okay. Fantastic. Well, I am absolutely thrilled to be chairing this panel and delighted to be with you all here virtually. Um, so let's just dive right in. A key proposition of GNT is that abstract or analytic normative theory about concepts like dignity and belonging and justice can importantly, miss forms of political and moral knowledge that become visible only through lived encounters with power, vulnerability, struggle, people living within conditions of exclusion and domination and constraint are not merely subjects of normative inquiry. I'm sure we've all faced this in our departments before. They are not only subjects of normative inquiry or empirical inquiry, but they're producers of normative knowledge and challenge and deepen and very often transform more conventional academic frameworks for talking about their conditions. Um, the remarkable handbook co-authors on this panel ask what we learn when normative inquiry begins from these rooted sites of experience. While coloniality was a framing sort of heuristic, a central concern from the panel, the work here also illuminates intersecting dynamics of racialized, gendered, cultural, socioeconomic, and epistemic justice as well. Natasha Bell, Farah Godrej, Cricket Keating, Raquel Madrigal, and Katerina Trout explore how practices of resistance, refusal, creativity, um, and collective action generate new political possibilities and normative horizons. Um, so in doing so, they invite us to see transgression as a productive source of democratic and normative insight. So I'm delighted to welcome them all and our audience and look forward to a conversation. Um, I'll keep the clock and I will put up a kind of Zoom notice. So hopefully those are available to you at 10 minutes so that you know you have two more to go. And it would be very helpful at the start of your presentations to just very briefly introduce yourself. I was going to put together bios, but whenever somebody else does that for me, they always get it wrong. So I'll let you present a very, very brief introduction to yourself, where you're teaching, where you're researching, and so on. I'll leave that to you. So why don't we just go in the order of the list and begin with Natasha. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's delightful to be with you virtually. I'm presenting on behalf of myself and Cricket Keating. And let me first introduce myself. My name is Natasha Bell, and I am at Arizona State University. I'm an associate professor in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences. I direct our master's program in social justice and human rights. And then I also run our college-wide council on advancing communities and responsibilities. I have had the opportunity to kind of take up um, GNT in my own work, also kind of feminist methodologies, interpretive methodologies. And this piece helped me think through collectively with Cricket about kind of how to move into decolonial work as well. And so I'll speak a little bit about what we try to accomplish in the piece, and then talk a little bit about some of the work Cricket and I are currently engaged in, and how we're trying to advance what we um, set out in this piece. So, what I'll do is really move us into this detailed kind of discussion of how we take up this question of participatory theory. And so In both political practice and research practice, the term participatory signals a commitment to inclusive and anti-hierarchical processes. And then we use the term participatory theorizing to denote political theoretical work that challenges hierarchical approaches to both movement building and theory building. And theorists who work at this juncture critique the institutional norms and structures that enforce top-down modes of theorizing. And they also call for and enact more inclusive and anti-hierarchical approaches in their theorizing work. Um, as we discuss in the paper, while some take up their focus in the academy itself, others interrogate ways that people practice political theorizing across different spheres of activities, from organizing to collective critique, visioning, and strategizing. And so, in the chapter, in that particular section, what we do is we examine the work of Patricia Hill Collins, Brooke Ackerley, Elisa Biria, Bell Hooks, and the Sunken Collective as exemplifying participatory approaches to normative theorizing that challenge the enclosures and hierarchy that alienate people from normative political theory as a practice. And in particular, we show how intersectionality as critical social theory, third world feminist social criticism, grassroots philosophy, theory as liberatory practice, and collective theorizing share a commitment to egalitarian analysis, visioning practices that open up and democratize spaces for theorizing within communities and then everyday exchanges, as well as within institutional and social movement structures and practices. And then for the sake of time, what I'll do is I'll focus in on two of these particular texts and looking at theorizing modes of practice within social movements and NGOs with the careful analysis of Communities Against Rape and Abuse, also known as CARA, and the Sunken Collective. And so within social movements, we see this kind of shift from grassroots and community-focused efforts to service-oriented, professionalized work. And this has led many movement organizations to become more and more professionalized and institutionalized. And often this shift has engendered organizational dynamics and hierarchies that can limit the egalitarian practice of theorizing, both within organizations and between these organizations and communities. And so, for example, the development of movement theory is often restricted by role and position within the organization, with those in leadership tasked with kind of this developing analysis and then strategy, and those in the rank and file who are subordinate, and then they are charged with enacting those particular strategies. A further limitation of many methods of political organizing is the lack of space they provide for sustained collective theoretical engagement. Even the kinds of approaches that prioritize face-to-face encounters, such as canvassing or house-to-house visits, are typically structured through highly scripted interactions, which significantly constrain opportunities for critique, visioning, and strategic reflection between organizers and community members. Such scripting is often adopted for understandable reasons. It's efficiency, message discipline, the ability to operate at scale, but it also comes at a high cost of a deeper relational engagement and the cultivation of a collective normative theorizing. And so, unless participants in the encounter, including the organizers and the organized, move off organizationally sanctioned scripts, they have little opportunity to learn from one another or to theorize together. And so, in grassroots philosophy, going against the grain, Elisa Birria traces ways that CARA, Communities Against Rape and Abuse, a community-based organization in Seattle, worked to counter this organizational and political dynamic by creating spaces for the collective work of normative visioning. And key for Cara, Beria explains, was the practice to theory model of theorizing that was animated by an organizational commitment to openness to different positions and new ideas. And for example, in grappling with issues of prison abolition and racial justice and its relationship to sexual and domestic violence, the organization worked collectively to engage with questions rather than resolving it. This form of collective theorizing enabled CAR to generate both theoretical and practical interventions for understanding the intersections between gender, violence, abolition, and community. Um, while also centering a normative vision of sustainable communities built on a foundation of safety, support, self-determination, and accountability, and decoupled from mass incarceration and the carceral state. And so for Bidia, this kind of Kara's work is an example of what she calls for as grassroots philosophy or a kind of participatory philosophy, an approach that rejects the paradigm of a single or a few elite men being considered the primary strategic thinkers of the movement, and that rather to move towards many minds thinking about this. Carr's gate opening theoretical practice illustrates the value of rejecting top-down models of theorizing in favor of participatory approaches that bring together multiple voices and perspectives in the collective work of generating community-driven analysis. The Sunken Collective is accounts for their theorizing in practice, documented in Playing with Fire. And this is another example of a practice of participatory theorizing that challenges the constraints of who gets to theorize in movement spaces through a sustained and collective reflection on their own lives, as well as their experience as field level workers in a feminist NGO in rural India. The group highlighted the caste, class, and religious hierarchies that mapped onto their lives and onto their NGO's organizational structure and practice. The group faced intense pressure and backlash from their NGO when they published their findings. One member was actually fired from the organization, and others were pressured to curtail their practice of collective reflection. And this backlash echoed pressures um, many of them experienced within their families and communities for speaking openly about inequitable um, power relations in those spaces. And then in the face of this backlash, the collective wrote that their commitment to the practice of theorizing itself gave them courage, even if it meant losing their jobs or facing trouble at home or in their communities. And what I'll do is I'll kind of end with the words of the Sunken Collective and a little bit of a reflection on that. And so, what the collective has said is whenever we reflect deeply and collectively on a set of personal or structural issues, that reflection ceases to be a critique of a specific individual or an organization. It becomes connected to all those social, economic, political conditions and processes within which we are living. Then why should we be afraid of saying everything that happened to us, but could not be spoken because our mouths were shut by tightly pressed hands belonging sometimes to our mothers and aunts, sometimes to our grandfathers and brothers, sometimes to people from our sesral, and sometimes from our own friends, co-workers, bosses, and ministers? For the Sunken Collective, The act of engaging in collective theorizing challenges the silences, the closures, and the hierarchies while opening up and democratizing spaces for theorizing within communities and movements. So, what I'll do is I'll pause there and then we can open it up to questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Natasha. 12 minutes on the nose, like you're a perfect model to, to launch the panel with. Okay, so Cricket then won't be speaking, is that right? You're speaking for the two of you. Okay. Okay, so then we'll turn next to Farah. Thanks, Farah.
Thank you so much, everyone, and good morning and good evening. Thank you to the editors for assembling this volume and for organizing this workshop, which is so exciting. My name is Farah Godrej, and I'm a professor of political science at the University of California, Riverside. I'm trained, I like to say originally as a political theorist, but in the latter part of my career have moved more toward what I now know is called engaged normative theorizing, using interpretive approaches. And I'm also the founding co-director of UCR's Prison BA program, which is going to pertain to some extent to what I'm going to talk about today. So I think that my presentation is going to follow really nicely from Natasha's. I think we're going to see some really great connections between our respective works. So my chapter is called Powerful Institutions, Vulnerable Participants, and Transgressive Research. And it sits in that final section of the volume on policy and impact. And it really asks the question, what does it actually take to do solidaristic, emancipatory, engaged theorizing with people who are confined inside violent and opaque institutions? So the work grows out of many years of research and volunteer work and ethnographic engagement in and around prisons. And although the chapter is framed through prisons, it's not just about prisons, right? Because prisons serve as an especially revealing case through which we can think about what grounded and engaged normative theorizing requires when we work with vulnerable communities whose lives are so profoundly shaped by these powerful institutions. And the prison in particular is useful as a setting for these questions because it concentrates forms of power that are often less visible elsewhere. It's highly controlled, it regulates movement, communication, access, and visibility. And as I discovered, it also regulates knowledge. And any researchers who attempt to study prisons very quickly discover that vulnerable populations often have very limited opportunities to speak in their own voice. So, in trying to navigate all of these realities, I found myself confronting a number of methodological and ethical questions that became the basis for this chapter. So, what I do in my chapter is I offer four implications or commitments that emerged for me from this work. And I offer them, not as a checklist, but as provocations in the kind of generative spirit that the editors have set for this whole handbook. So let me talk about these four commitments that I describe, or four implications. The first one is what I call unavoidable partiality. Political science has historically, as we all know, been very attached to this ideal of neutrality. And, we get taught that rigorous scholarship requires detachment and objectivity and distance from the subjects that we study. And of course, many, many different traditions and schools of thought have challenged this idea that knowledge can ever be produced from a neutral standpoint. Interpretivists, feminists, decolonial thinkers, and all manner of critical traditions remind us that knowledge is always produced from somewhere, and that we researchers are always situated within relations of power, and that this so-called view from nowhere is really an illusion. Now, this is very clear when one enters or does research inside a prison, because everyone who enters is subject to relentless messaging that is inviting them to adopt the institution's own understanding of incarcerated people as dangerous, as manipulative, or inherently suspect. So the institution very often offers us a kind of ready-made narrative about who these people are and why the prison exists. But in my own work, my interviews and my volunteer work, I found a very different story. I found a story of people who were victimized by inequitable systems, who were enduring humiliation and structural disadvantage. So my ethnographic immersion taught me very quickly that I could not write neutrally about a system that wreaks such havoc with impunity, because in that setting, neutrality is not just objectivity, it's complicity. It's a silence that naturalizes injustice, that basically calls on us to accept the assumptions of the status quo. So the first task or commitment of solidaristic grounded normative theory is to articulate your own embeddedness in power rather than hide behind a kind of false veil of value neutrality that in the end, I think simply reproduces the epistemic authority of the already powerful. So that's the first commitment I talk about. The second is what I call writing the I back in. So again, political science has traditionally encouraged authors to remove themselves from their writing. Personal experience and emotion and subjectivity are often treated as distractions from scholarly analysis. And of course, this has been resoundingly challenged again by interpretive and autoethnographic traditions, which have argued that the researcher is not external to the production of knowledge. And in fact, the self is one of the instruments through which knowledge is generated. So I argue in my chapter that first person writing is not self-indulgence. It's actually an ethical and a practical necessity, because I quickly discovered that my experiences of negotiating access and interacting with these institutions and moving between different roles were themselves producing important forms of knowledge. And ethically speaking, I became increasingly uncomfortable with the model in which incarcerated participants were expected to share intimate details of their lives while I remained hidden behind a kind of impersonal scholarly voice. So, writing in the first person became a way of making visible the relationships through which knowledge was produced. It not only allowed me to acknowledge my own positionality, including moments when I occupied positions of privilege and authority, but also moments when I found myself constrained by institutional power. It also allowed me to note that I was a person marked by my own race and gender as I moved between those worlds. And it became a way of making my scholarship more accessible because my participants had opened about their suffering and their pain, and that work advanced my career. So the least I could do was make my own story legible and accessible to them rather than turning their words into a kind of detached morass of academic jargon. So I would submit that if research participants cannot recognize themselves in what we write or cannot meaningfully engage with the final product, then something important has been lost. So this is the second commitment. Writing the I back in is what I think keeps the scholarship accountable to the people it depends on. The third commitment I talk about is something that I think Natasha has already described really beautifully. It's co-producing knowledge, not just about participants, but with them. So again, right, traditional academic research very often positions the scholar as the knowledge producer. Fauna talked about this in some of her opening remarks, and participants as sources of information. But many engaged traditions have challenged this hierarchy, and they've argued that vulnerable and marginalized communities possess forms of knowledge that are not merely empirical inputs into theory, but are themselves theoretical resources. So rather than treat incarcerated persons as, again, objects of my scholarly gaze, I had to really stretch my own academic training to think alongside them as knowledge producers in their own right. And in my book, I talk about how I ended up co-authoring a chapter with two incarcerated women. Over time, we exchanged written reflections that then became a co-authored chapter of my book. And the point here was not merely to include their voices, it was to let my interlocutors discipline my thinking, to rethink presumptions, to relearn perspectives, and to let them really reshape the questions I was asking. So, co production means taking seriously the possibility that participants can shape the theoretical frameworks we use and that we allow their priorities and categories to challenge our own. And it also means, of course, recognizing obligations of reciprocity. so that we, owe them forms of engagement that recognize their agency and their intellectual contributions. Now, I do note in the chapter that this kind of participatory co-production is not an easy fix for epistemic oppression because it carries a lot of its own contradictions and sort of embedded unequal power relations. I think we have to be sort of honest and upfront about that. But I think it is a necessary first step toward decentering the hierarchies that uphold the academy. So that's the third commitment I talk about. And the fourth and final one, which I think is going to be the most controversial one, or maybe not so controversial, we'll see, is what I call insurrectionary or transgressive research, thinking and writing against power. So in prisons, official access often comes with significant constraints. Researchers might be required to follow institutional rules, not just rules by prisons, but also rules from IRBs that limit what they can observe and who they can speak with and how findings are represented. So when these powerful institutions control access to research sites and can effectively veto what you publish, solidarity sometimes requires refusing to self-censor or even circumventing the strictures that hand approval to the very institution that you're studying. So, one of the most important realizations in my own prison work was that some of the richest forms of learning emerged outside officially sanctioned research channels. Sometimes providing a fuller, richer understanding of the lives and voices and experiences of marginalized communities requires us to carefully transgress rules, carefully being the key word. But circumventing the IRB is not the same as abandoning ethics, because one of the things I talk about in my chapter is the alternative that I managed to build, which is a kind of ethical audit by trusted colleagues who are formerly incarcerated themselves, people with lived experience to ask the right questions. So, solidaristic research, I've argued, can invent its own protocols of accountability that ask similarly positioned people to act in lieu of institutional gatekeepers. So the point here is that institutional ethics and solidaristic ethics do not always perfectly overlap. In fact, more often than not, I think they might converge because sometimes institutions regulate access in ways that protect themselves rather than vulnerable populations. So in these contexts, researchers might need to think creatively about how to remain accountable to participants while also challenging institutional barriers to knowledge. Okay, 2 minutes. All right. So let me, try to wrap up quickly in the time I have remaining. What I want to argue here is that grounded normative theorizing might sometimes require challenging the boundaries that institutions place around what can be known and who can speak and how knowledge is produced. And I want to say that this kind of transgression doesn't have to be all or nothing. It can be selective, it can be cautious, it can be piecemeal. It's a kind of constant renegotiation between the compromises that buy you access and the transgressions that let you tell a fuller story. So I think that these four implications that I've offered here, they emerge from prisons, but I hope and think that they travel well beyond the prison context. I want to just end by saying a few words about the project I'm working on right now and how that has gotten me to really think about these four implications that I've just offered you in closing. So since I wrote this chapter, I've been involved, as I said, in founding and co-directing a prison BA program at our institution. And we launched this program 2 years ago. And I'm happy to report that our first cohort just graduated last week with a UCR bachelor's degree. So in the first term of the program, I taught a course to incarcerated students in which we discussed actually critiques of the carceral state. And when I did the thing that I recommended in my own chapter, which is thinking together with system impacted students and letting them discipline my thinking, I found that they actually pushed back on the more radical abolitionist critiques of incarceration that they encountered. So I'm now grappling with the fact that punishment actually seems to persist for many incarcerated persons as a morally meaningful, even if deeply flawed, language through which things like accountability and agency get negotiated. So I want to say that this co-production cuts both ways. If we're serious about centering these voices, we have to sit with the ones that do not confirm our priors. The people we claim to emancipate have something to teach us about the very concepts we theorize, like freedom and justice and accountability and so on, but they will not always tell us what we hope to hear. So I think this is the uncomfortable edge of grounded theorizing that I'm sitting with and kind of working through right now. So let me stop there, and thank you all so much.
Lovely, provocative. And the through lines now between Farah and Natasha's papers are fantastic. So a lot to talk about in a few minutes. But first, Raquel, thank you.
Thank you. Good evening and good morning, everyone. And thank the editor for being present today. I'm really excited to be here. Um, and I'm really inspired right now listening to both Natasha and Farah. Um, Also, I just want to say I was an undergraduate taking Farah's classes in political theory at UCR, so this is a full circle moment. And I'm just really excited to share my contributions, and I see further through lines with all that's been shared so far. I want to start off with just a little bit about my positionality, because in addition to all that Farah laid out, I was thinking that about positionality as you were talking, and um, that was really important for me in my chapter. And I realized this was a chapter about my methodology. And oh, I'm also teaching at Hunter College. So I'm from California, but I found my way on the East Coast, living in Brooklyn and New York City. And so with all of those experiences of just being, in North America, coast to coast, it's been interesting my methodology since graduating in 2019 with my dissertation. Um, I'm a second generation Mexican American, Chicana Latina, but I have Spanish ancestry and Yaqui and Raramuri and Tarahumara indigenous ancestry, but because of the native politics in North America, specifically the United States, I don't claim those identities. I don't have any membership, so that's also a fraught conversation here with Native folks and Native academics. So with that said, my chapter titled Centering Indigeneity and Critical Relational Methodology in Grounded Normative Theories of Immigration and Borders, it became really important for me to, in my interest of immigration and borders, to expand myself and become uncomfortable with centering Native perspectives in that discourse, because it's normatively dominated by, scholarship in Latino studies or Chicano studies or women of color feminist studies or border and immigration studies. They leave out the conversation of Native perspectives. And so as someone coming into that scholarship, I was kind of turned upside down, and I had to explore other questions that were arising for me when I was realizing in my study of borders and immigration, what does centering Native land, lifeway, sovereignty, and political politics reveal around borders and immigration when we look at Native perspectives on that. And so I'm coming from the interdisciplinary fields of ethnic studies, women of color feminisms, transnational feminisms, um, and critical indigenous studies, indigenous feminist studies. And I'm seeing connections with all those fields in an articulation of grounded normative theory. And so I argue in this chapter that the study of borders and immigration requires the centering of Indigenous presence, lifeways, lands, and sovereignty for several reasons. The first is about the urgent importance of centering Indigenous peoples, given that their lands have been colonized. And so in this chapter, I really look at the US-Mexico border, and I offer a case study through the Tohono people that live in southern Arizona. They straddle both northern Mexico and southern US in Tucson, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. And I look at political activists from that Native community and how they're interrogating and critiquing the border, and really centering their perspectives and their philosophies. As Fada was saying, really highlights a different interrogation of power and a different articulation of borders and immigration. And so this chapter in centering indigeneity, the questions that I came up with that really reframe how we talked about borders and immigration um, are several. And so I'll just share a few of them. But the first one is just the question, how and why should we center indigeneity within phenomena of borders and immigration? And just that question alone is really a paradigm shift of, oh, there are Native people and we do need to center them, and what does that mean? And the second question is, what becomes legible when we spotlight indigeneity in the phenomenon of borders and immigration? And for me, that answer is the foregrounding of Native land requires our examination of borders as something as not normal, but as a transgression of empire and imperialism against and upon Native people, which then further transgresses towards targeting, indigenous migrants or undocumented migrants and so forth today, and how we're seeing that happening. And another question is, how do we theorize immigration as indigenous migration when we think about, I know this is like global conversation and I'm coming from, the North American perspective and specifically migration through the US-Mexico border and thinking about Mayans and Guatemalans and indigenous Central Americans, or even indigenous Haitians crossing the southern border into the United States. So the centering of indigeneity also requires thinking about migration as an indigenous phenomenon. And that goes into further interrogating racial logics of how racism erases indigeneity at the site of borders. And when that happens, um, you know, without centering indigeneity, we wouldn't otherwise know that. So it's also an interrogation of how borders and immigration laws are this racialized project of indigenous erasure, as well as indigenous land dispossession. And so these are some of the other questions that come up when we center indigeneity. And another question is, how do we reconcile imperial colonial forces of indigenous migration on stolen indigenous land? So in the effort for indigenous sovereignty and land back, it creates complications that there's not easy answers to. So indigenous migrants crossing here on indigenous land, what does immigration advocacy look like, or solidarity with both immigrants and indigenous struggles for sovereignty? So those are the kind of challenges that this kind of work brings up and reveals to us. And then also for me, being someone born in California, but having this diverse background, how do I participate in that, in my own unsettlement of being, born in the LA region, but that's Tongva land, and that I'm engaging in this kind of work. So for me, the reflective part of grounded normative theory is really important, and beyond, not that there needs to be solutions right away, but to sit in the discomfort of my positionality and my relationality to these groups that I'm looking at. So indigenous migrants or indigenous peoples whose lands have been dissected by borders and are living under hostile, violent conditions by Border Patrol. So all to say is, in my chapter, I put forth this methodology that I call the critical relational methodology. And I see that as an articulation of grounded normative theory, because it helps not only excavate indigenous erasure and genocide within political theorization of borders and immigration, but it also expands our analysis of questions of borders and immigration in a very challenging way and in a very urgent way that's really important, because indigenous erasure and invisibility has continued and is still something to be seriously recognized today. And so this kind of difficult work reveals the productive ways of materializing and sustaining solidarity, equity, justice, and liberation across group difference and various historical contextual specificities. So the relationality part of my methodology is understanding racial historical experiences as uneven and connected in disjoint ways. So looking at the site of the border where the Honodan people are living dissected and bisected while Indigenous migrants are crossing. And so, and then my positionality is as someone writing about that. Those are a lot of uneven relationalities. And I think the justice work, the critical work for grounded normative theory is to have an honest conversation about what all of that means in our understanding and comprehensive prismatic view of all of those things, the author writing, what I'm writing about, and the people that are giving us this knowledge. And I'm really looking to Native perspectives about that. And so centering those voices, as Vada was saying. And in my last 2 minutes, yeah, so this is really self-reflective work, and it's honest work, and it doesn't necessarily have answers right away. And I think that's really important. The just sitting with the discomfort and knowing that there's an uneven phenomenon to think about on a collective level is the most honest place we can be with this kind of work. So I'll just leave it there, and thank you for your time and listening, and hope you enjoy all of our work as you read it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Raquel. Thank you, everybody. So we can now open things up to questions. I have a bunch of them, but why don't we start with the audience and those sitting in
I'm sorry.
Hamburg.
I think you are working off of a old schedule, and you don't have Kat. So we're going to do.
Oh,
Kat.
I'm so sorry, Kat.
We're all right.
So,
There have been many versions. It's okay. But we're going to go to Kat in the room, which will be very exciting, and hopefully that'll give.
Of course.
The login.
That was totally my mess up because Kat is here in my list. I am so sorry, Kat. Please go.
You're good. And she's going to do a presentation share. So just
Okay.
All good, Fauna. It's nice to see you.
Thank you.
And then
And you want to see them at this side or no? Presentation?
either. But I definitely want to start the presentation. Yeah, like we did. Yeah.
Perfect.
Good.
Yeah.
And I think, let me double check. Okay.
And you're good. The camera's not going to see you.
Okay. Hi, everyone online. It was wonderful to hear your presentations. Thank you all so much for being here. I feel really privileged and grateful to be a contributor to this handbook and to be here in Germany. So my chapter is lucky chapter number 13, Geographic Terrains of Struggle, Practicing Transformative Solidaristic Epistemic Politics with Historical Actors. And I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Katarina Trout, Visiting Assistant Professor of Political Science at Gettysburg College in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Very important battle happened there, and speech in 1863. So that sort of situates where I am. I've been there for about a year. Teaching and continuing my research. So over the course of this presentation, I will be introducing the chapter and some core components and situating it within my book project, Poisonous Insecurity, Political Theory, and the Architectures of Colonial Imperialism. Sorry, it's a recent name change. So grounded normative theory's mandate is driven to address the marginalization of voices and silences created by design by common and dominant social science methods. An ongoing violence of colonialism and slavery is its interference with activists and theorists' access to historical data and knowledge relevant to political theorizing. What we can know about the past is constrained by the many layers of historical production. So Michel Trio, a historian and social theorist, talks about this as an unevenness or an insertion of silences into historical production at 4 critical points. And I'll make them 3 points to kind of simplify it, but I'll embed all of his meaning in there. So the first is the moment of the creation of sources. So a letter is written, a building is built, a police record is created. So the moment that sources are created, or objects are left behind, developed and left behind. The second is when historians and memory workers decide what is an authoritative source and how to assemble facts, archiving work, for example. And the third and fourth are when facts are retrieved for narrative creation in collective memory, as well as choices in what is significant retrospectively for history making, such as textbooks, memorials, conservation projects. And Trio writes, because historical traces are inherently uneven, sources are not created equal. Documentation in buildings are physical conditions or physical traces that are not inherent, that have an inherent unevenness to them. This unevenness extends to what is felt and sensed, Trio writes, making our access to historical lived experiences of sensation and what is felt uneven and unequal. Material, we learned from feminist, decolonial, critical race theorists that material and somatic experiences are the stuff of thinking and knowing. Material and somatic histories are the building blocks of normative political theorizing. So a research question of the book, of which I have 2, the second one will come later. The first is, in what ways should political theorists approach material and somatic histories in order to struggle with legacies of violence? So it's a broader book project, and I'll sort of build in how the handbook chapter is built into this. So how would grounded normative theory typically deal with this question? It commits itself to comprehensiveness, epistemic inclusion, epistemic accountability, and recursivity, where social science methods marginalize epistemologies and voices. For a few reasons that I won't get into, I hone in on epistemic accountability, or maybe it will make sense in a moment, right? As Ackerley and some of the folks in the room and online write about, epistemic accountability is defined as it requiring sustained engagement with context and actors from fieldwork as theorists iteratively develop their normative arguments. Given that there is an inequality in who leaves traces and thus who can be reconstructed as a historical actor, I wonder about how to be epistemically accountable to those who are no longer with us, those who have passed away, who are separated by timelines of hundreds of years, and yet whose lives, actions, and interpretations are a part of the dynamic historical structure. So global empire and slavery, if we're thinking about international political economy, that differently situated peoples today continue to struggle with and against, that I am actually struggling with and against as I theorize. So put simply, in what ways can we be accountable as theorists, scholar, activists to historical empirical contexts and participants who are no longer with us, especially given our living within a shared historical structure of violence, a shared world made in the image of empire, slavery, and white supremacy? So before I get to that complex theory slide, that maybe you won't even be listening to me as I put up all those words, but so in the chapter, I consider the ways in which we can bring a politics of struggle to architectural histories and current historical sites, dominant historical spaces, as well as reveal marginalized, erased, lesser known spaces and architectures that should be included in a study. A relation to physical conditions, and this sort of as a precursor, a relation to physical conditions and traces can be a relation of struggle, and a struggle that inspires creativity in source identification, methods, data collection, and interpretation. So a part of how I set up how I and other theorists can be in relation to actors across timelines across boundaries of life and death, conceptually, to share in thinking or thought with them, is through Iris Marion Young's conception of structure and Catherine McKittrick's geographic terrains of struggle. Well, she has geographies of struggle and terrains of struggle, and I sort of bring those pieces together. So Young's conception of structure, particularly when she describes the social connection model, is about connecting actors across borders and developing responsibility between actors across borders. Right, so her definition of structure is an ongoing meaning-making process that includes actors' interpretation of and action on physical conditions and the ways in which these constrain and enable other actions and interpretations. So if I think about historical traces or the physical conditions that connect actors across time, that the past actor's interpretation and action on physical conditions is actively enabling and constraining my actions and interpretations today, I can start to think about responsibility and relationship across timeline. And then I bring in Catherine McKittrick's geographies of struggle, geographic terrains of struggle, particularly drawing from Fanon's concept of bodily schemas to think about how relations to there's a mutual construction and alterability of place, object, and place, other, self, object. Yes, there's a collection of words. Identity, place, and object is how I'll leave that. And so I bring those together with some abolitionist theorists, Black feminist theorists, Saidiya Hartman, Celeste Winson, Robin Kelly, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, to think about what it would look like to develop a solidaristic, and Farah was talking about this earlier, right? Solidaristic epistemic politics in historical spatial production, and in particular. So I synthesize a few approaches from Black feminist historians and literary scholars, primarily Christina Sharp, Saidiya Hartman, Toni Morrison, and Marissa Fuentes, alongside other critical race, intersectional feminists, disability, and queer theorists, to outline some concrete steps for putting geographic terrains of struggle into practice. It's a lot of abstract theory, if you will. And then I aim throughout the chapter 13 in the handbook, to move from methodology to method. So really giving and offering historical, literary, ethnographic, and creative methods and pieces for that. So I have these little special boxes that say, you know, this is how you do this, or this is how I did this. So the 5 sort of elements or principles of the methodology are care, principled boundaried connection, which is a reflexive awareness of positionality that centers the sensory and relational, creativity, sensory and spatial analysis, and community. And in particular, with community building long-term trusting relationships with political activists who are struggling against the very legacies of the structure that you are studying. So that's a place of learning and of feedback. I liked, Farah, the way that you put it, disciplining your thinking and your knowing. I find community to be an important place for that. So to sort of show or talk a little bit about how I do this in the book project, the substantive book project question is, what does a particular architecture, 18th century slave trading fortification, and its connected global spaces reveal about the politics and legacies of slavery? Very quickly go through this, but I work through historical sites, conduct ethnographic studies of the physical buildings, forts, particularly in the Gold Coast, present day Ghana, west coast of Africa. I use the British National Archives, reading letters and ledgers written by the white company men that are living there. And I study architectural history of fortification in Europe and sort of how it met the Atlantic economy during the 18th century in particular, in order to reconstruct a white imperial geography sort of how white company men's bodies were meeting their material conditions, meeting the architectures, and they're from there developing a normative way of projecting out and reading, interpreting land and bodies, and organizing the developing knowledge by organizing information about land and about different peoples that they're encountering. Could say a lot about that, but I want to get to how I, especially because I only have a minute left, how the methodology really pressed me to focus in on a fragment in the digital archival source, actually, a prominent military engineer in the 18th century for the British Empire, Josley Watson. He surveyed and built forts all over the Atlantic, so West Africa, Caribbean, Newfoundland, and Gibraltar. He was back and forth across the Atlantic in the 18th century, so survived a lot of journeys across the Atlantic in the 18th century, is recorded in this list of army officer or military officers as dying from poison given to him in a beverage by a domestic. And that's sort of all that I know. And I had seen this and I sort of left it where it was because I wanted to, given my own positionality, I thought it was, my responsibility to reconstruct this white imperial geography, and then learning from the feminist theorists that I was reading, thought through how I cannot just leave this here. So I started to think through, meditating over many years, who this person might have been, learning more about poisoning used as a form of resistance by enslaved peoples across the Americas, and learning more about maroon communities and the ways in which they lived on, formerly enslaved people who ran away and created self-sufficient communities, how they lived on very inhospitable in inhospitable environments, right? Places that were hard to develop plantations, for example, or difficult to live on, such as swamps or mountainous regions. Learned about different figures such as Queen Nanny of the Maroons, the first Maroon War in Jamaica, which was happening at the exact same time in the 1750s as Josley Watson was in and out of Jamaica and refortifying the port there, learning more about medicinal uses and different enslaved people's knowledge of, okay, I'm at 13 minutes, knowledge of plants and poison, bringing in novels such as Ghayazi's Homegoing, thinking about the different materials besides lime and brick that are written about in letters that are a part of this architecture, this living architecture, which is also human bodies are a part of that architecture. And then being in community with a Black women-led community garden and an abolitionist transformative justice collective and group has been a part of that. I really like this language of disciplining, thinking and knowing has been a part of that for me. And then visiting in Newfoundland last summer, and again, engaging with different artists there. So sorry, I'm super over time. That's all.
That's okay. A minute and a half isn't super overtime. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. So lovely. So now we get to questions. Are there any questions from audience, hi, Cricket. Nice to see you.
Sorry, I'm late, everyone.
That's okay. Anybody in Hamburg, anybody in the audience, would you like to start us off? We have 14 minutes for questions and conversation. Genevieve, hi.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to listen to the papers, and really to see the handbook kind of be animated in this way. So yeah, I have quite a few questions, but I'll just kind of narrow in on one question in particular that I had been struggling with in my work with sex workers in North America, and in particular, sex worker rights activists. Of course, my approach that I've been developing over a number of years, a solidaristic approach to GNT, was very much you know, based on relationships, long time relationships with members of this community. And I remember when I first started this project, um, I don't like 15 years ago, I was quite concerned about Farah, what you spoke to when you're working with community members and their views, and it's in particular like their normative views, because again, it's a solidaristic approach. And so for me, my kind of going into this work was, okay, I want to listen to this community and help amplify their normative claims. But what happens if their normative views, the way you put it was, are at odds with your priors? I and and so I'm curious about that. I mean, basically my question is, so what are you going to do other than kind of sitting with that, right? So for me, it never it never came to, like it never happened in my case. But I was really concerned around trafficking and because there's a lot of discourse, of course, um, that there's a lot of trafficking and sex work and so on and so forth. And yet from sex workers, it's like occasionally, yes, there is coercion. And of course there is trafficking, but there isn't this kind of exceptionalism around sex work, right? This happens in other industries. And that, in fact, was borne out in the research that I did. But the concern for me was, well, what happens if there is an exceptionalism? So I'm just curious to hear you speak more about that, and perhaps others can chime in as well. Thank you.
Sure. Shall I just go ahead and respond, Fauna?
Please.
Thank you so much, Genevieve, for that. I was reminded when you were speaking about, perhaps you already know my good friend Samantha Magic, who works on sex work at CUNY. And I actually talked to her about some of the dilemmas that I was facing in my own work. And I remember her saying, yeah, well, of course, people who come from vulnerable communities often have normative views that are, right, not in keeping with what we might expect. And she talked about how so many of the sex workers she either worked with or interviewed had views that entailed, like, yes, sex work should be criminalized. Yes, sex work should be made illegal, right? And she sort of instinctively was like, well, of course. And I was like, wow, so this is really a thing, right? So I'm not sure that I have like much more of a good answer to give you, Genevieve, beyond just like, sitting with that contradiction. And the way it came up for me was really interesting. And I'm grappling with this as we speak. I taught this course inside prison to incarcerated people. And it is the exact same course I would teach on campus when we would discuss the carceral state in very critical terms. And the interesting thing is when I taught it on campus, and Raquel knows this because she was an undergrad on my campus, I come from a campus where, people are super critical, super progressive, super radical, right? Like abolition is like, it's in the air, it's in the air, it's in the ether. So not at all controversial. And so when I would teach this class on campus, it didn't feel like I was right facing pushback or struggling against anything. And literally from the minute I taught these same ideas inside prison, it was like a wall of pushback. And the pushback was really interesting. It was, no, 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 we all need to be held responsible and accountable for the harm we have caused, right? And it was really personal and it was really, really strong. And I was very taken aback by it. And in retrospect, I feel really naive. I feel really naive for not having been prepared, right? Especially given my own prior work in, with incarcerated people, especially given that in my own work, I had really sort of parsed out some of the internal contradictions of this stuff. And but to be confronted with it so right viscerally, right in the sort of gut of the racialized carceral state, if you will, in the belly of the beast, I was unprepared for that. So I have been sitting with that, Genevieve, really for the past, I would say, year or so, and I'm trying to sort of grapple with it and think through, right? what does that mean? And I think, I mean, where I have landed for now, because again, as I say, I don't really have like a grand, response to all of this. Where I have landed for now is like I have to take this seriously. I cannot dismiss this as false consciousness because I think that is the temptation. And that's where so many people go, right? When I talk about this with a lot of with people in scholarly settings, the first explanation that is often given, or the one that I find people gravitating toward, and I think is tempting, right? There's a I think for good reason, there's a temptation for us to gravitate toward the explanation that this is some version of false consciousness because, right, the system tells people this. And yes, I mean, I want to acknowledge that that is to some extent true. I do think powerful institutions like prisons and law enforcement, right, in your case with sex workers, they do have a kind of, knowledge setting power that can override, right, people's ability to think about these things. So I don't want to dismiss the importance of like the relentless messaging and the way that it can shape people's thinking. On the other hand, I also want to say these were really astute people, really politically astute people whose thinking I was not willing to dismiss their thinking as simply a product of false consciousness. So that's kind of where I've landed for now, which is we have to think beyond false consciousness. We've got to really accord basic respect to people's views, even and especially when they don't say the things that like we hope for them to say. So I don't know that that's particularly satisfying, but that's kind of where I've landed for now. But thank you so much for bringing that up.
Could I ask a question of both of you? Because I think about this in my work all the time, especially when you work in a more solidaristic mode of GNT, where you actually, in your heart, are hoping for the best for the people that you're working with. And oftentimes when and actually what Raquel brought to the table is an illustration of this. So a nonprofit that you happen to work with is modeled on really hierarchical terms, and you recognize that if the nonprofit wasn't working in such hierarchical terms, they could actually produce more equitable and inclusive results. What is the role of a political theorist in speaking truth from our perspectives? I mean, are we muzzled? I mean, one of the things that I've recognized working with, community groups over decades now is that enough trust has been built that sometimes we have conflicts. And I don't see myself as a receptacle of everything they say to me. I can push back. And the relationship permits that kind of rough road of finding kind of resolution to some of these kinds of tensions, which may be kind of, you know, inherent in our positionality. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, and Fauna, you're kind of hinting at it. It's that, look, this research takes time and commitment,
Yeah.
and it's based on relationships and good relationships that provide the context for that give and take. And, or is it give and take? I don't think it's give and take. Sometimes it's more like, no, let's have a discussion about this. These are my views. I respect your views, but there are differences. And so this to me is what it looks like to really do this co-production of knowledge. And so, I mean, in the case of sex work, like it's very clear to me that the language of false consciousness has led to, models that are in place around, the criminalization of the purchasing of sexual services. And that's very, very problematic. And I mean, I agree that, of course, prisons and the legal system, they have these kind of formative forces that work on our psyche that can constrain us, but so do many other systems. We're all kind of constrained, right? And this is our role, I think, as political theorists, which is to push back on those constraining forces that kind of, I don't know if that's helpful.
And could I jump in for a sec too? And again, I'm so
Sure.
sorry I'm late today, but I'm just thinking of that example, Kara, that you give us about the, people wanting to recognizing that they've done harm and thinking about how to address that harm. And then I'm also thinking about your work in contemplative political theory. And so what a rich conversation that could be with you in terms of thinking about modes of addressing harm that move against the state or beyond the state or without the state. So I just think that particular conversation, I can imagine how rich it could be.
Yeah, and if I could can I just comment on that as well? Because
Yes,
just
please.
yeah, what you're saying, Fauna, about like the dialogue and the push and pull, and then how Genevieve is calling it this co-production, like even Cricket, the way you're reframing, like right, punishment versus recognizing that you harmed someone else. Like in abolition, in transformative justice, recognizing that you harmed someone else and sitting with that is a part of it. And there's so much that comes with it. And I wonder, Farah, if you engaged in like talking back, right? Like, is it really about punishment, or is it about the space to realize that you've hurt someone else? Like, and parsing out what it really getting really like to the thing, and is the concept of punishment the right one? So, me thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. Should I jump in, or do we want to
Sure.
collect more
Are
comments,
there other
perhaps?
questions? Are there other directions that people would like to go? Because we have only a couple of minutes. If not, Farah, I can't see anybody
Sure.
else. Yeah.
But also, I kind of wanted to hear from Raquel as well. Raquel, may I give you the
Yeah.
floor for a bit also?
I was listening to Genevieve and Fatish share too, and what was resonating with me was something similar. I lived in Albuquerque for 9 years, and it's surrounded by Pueblo reservations, and then the larger Diné Navajo reservation, and you pick up on the politics over time, and you see settler colonialism is not a thing of the past, but a very lived present. Uh, situation that's very unsettling once when you take on indigenous philosophies and you listen to native peoples from a critical lens. But the what I was resonating with Genevieve and Clara was that in the Navajo reservation, there's these political leaders that are Trump supporters, and you would think like that doesn't make any sense. But it's another situation of me articulating the same thing as you all are confronting. And then for the Tohonodan people, the complexity of people of who want to have their sovereignty back of their land and not have border patrol invasive on their territories, but then because of the poor conditions that they live in and lack of access to healthcare and running water and or just resources and having money flowing in, that they will sign up and work for Border Patrol. And and I interviewed a Border Patrol agent, and I asked him this question about, recognition of the Tohono sovereignty. And he's like, oh yeah, we recognize their sovereignty. Yet he's showing me where the checkpoints are along their land. So I resonate with the same kind of complexities. Um, and I think for me, going deeper beyond the false consciousness is just what are the everyday lived conditions of violence as normal that make people make these negotiations, right? That might not be those pure alignments with being anti-state or anti-colonialism or anti-imperialist. Um, and I think myself is an example of that. I can be anti-capitalist, but I have an iPhone. So, again, for me, I think rather than having a solution or having a solution to fix it, it's more like um, we're still at the level of needing to have conversation, these tough conversations, and the more we can learn from each other through that engagement of difference and encounter, we can have actionable change. So I think it's a slower process and maybe not as fast as we would want it. And that's not the only one. There are actions to take and activism and organizing, but at the level of understanding and comprehension and learning, I think that's where I'm at right now. But that was my insight in listening to the conversation so far.
Thanks so much, Raquel. This was like way too short. We would have a wonderful conversation if we were sitting in Hamburg together over a beer. And I just enjoyed your presentation so much. One lingering thought, we don't have time to talk about it, but it's something maybe we're all thinking about. The universities in which we operate right now are more assertively embracing their neutrality, which is making the kind of work that we do even more risky. And so I'm sure you all have experiences in this domain, and I'd like to leave us with that thought, like how we're navigating our universities right now in this moment. I wish we could talk more, but we've reached time. We're 2 minutes over time. So thank you all so much. It's just an honor and a privilege to be in this handbook with all of you. So thank you. Thank you.
Well, we are going to break for coffee. We hope you do as well, but we hope we get to see you for the next panel. Thanks, everybody. Well, I was well chaired from the virtual side. I think that's the first for the witness. So good job, Mana.
Cool. Cool. Okay. See you all soon.
Thank you. No, the other.
Hey, great to see everyone. So welcome to the last panel of the day, regrounding theory. We have just an hour and we have three chapter authors to present, two of whom are co-editors of the volume, which is interesting. And so I think as with the last panel, I'll ask people to introduce themselves at the front end of their presentation, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. So I think the order is going to be Sarah Marie Weed, and then we go with Brooke Ackerley and Fauna Foreman also joining online. And take it away, Sarah.
Okay, amazing. Hi, everyone. Am I able to share my slides? Share, let's try. Oh. But in the meantime, I can introduce myself. So I'm Sarah Marie Weeb. I'm an associate professor based here at the University of Victoria on the west coast of Canada. Use she, her pronouns. UVic is based here in Coast Salish territory, so unceded Lekwungen, Wasanich, and the Esquimalt, Wasupsum, Songhees territory. I'm a non-Indigenous scholar, but today I will be sharing with you a little bit about my research based in Treaty 9 territory, which is the northern part of Ontario, primarily on kind of the west coast of the James Bay and Hudson Bay region. So let's see if I can share my slides. I was afraid of this. Why?
We do have them.
Yeah. Wonder why it's not letting me. Oh, maybe it's working. Let's try this.
Give her a chance, I guess.
Yeah, of course.
Oh, I think it's getting fixed. Oh no. Okay, it's saying I have to quit Zoom and then log back in to share them. So maybe if it's okay, if you don't mind sharing them on your end, just so I don't have to log out and log back in.
Um, yeah, and while we wait, I was going to say, these three chapters are from three different sections of the handbook. Sarah's chapter is from the methodologies section, section two. Brooks is section one, traditions, foundations, and directions, and Fauna's chapter with Teddy Cruz is the very final chapter in the volume, and it is in the policy and impact section. So we're going to be talking across those sections. All right, here we go.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'll dive in. So yeah, the title of my chapter is Engaged Theory, Contested Ground, Cultivating Care, Connections, and Community Through Sensory Research. The image that you see here, this is of Indigenous women this is in front of the Parliament of Canada. One woman's holding an eagle feather, another a sign that says, "Remember Canada, you're in a treaty partner." And this was from the height of the I Don't Know More movement. At the time, I was just finishing up my PhD when this movement was really active, and it kind of led to this project, which I'll share a little bit about today. The next slide. So just in brief, I mentioned I'm from the West Coast. I grew up in this area known as the Salish Sea. My background is in political science and public administration now, and I do a lot of sort of political ecology and environmental justice research. And one of the methodologies that I've used a fair bit in my research is community engaged research. So I will focus on that mainly today. And just on the right, more recently, I've been quite involved in climate justice research, and this was a shift for me personally based on my lived experience of the 2021 heat dome here in British Columbia. Next slide. So the work that I'm going to share today is part of a larger book project that came out a number of years ago called Life Against States of Emergency, Revitalizing Treaty Relations from Attawapiskat. So you see the same covering image there. And then prior to that, I had done a lot of work looking at pollution exposure and questions around environmental racism and environmental justice in a region known as Canada's Chemical Valley. Both projects used community engaged research with First Nations communities. Unfortunately, a lot of the issues are ongoing related to continuous pollution exposure, states of emergency in the Aamjiwnaang region. Both of these communities are situated in Ontario, to give the international audience a bit of context there. So kind of like the center of Canada. That's great. Yeah, the next slide's fine. So moving on, I'm based in a school of public administration now, and so something that I take to heart in my role is thinking about education and how we have so much power as educators. We may not be able to change people's minds in the general world and public sometimes, but we do have a lot of agency when it comes to teaching. And so I take that really critically when I think about, many of the students I'm teaching, they go on and they work in the public service. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission produced many calls to action a number of years ago. And so the call to action in Canada that really sticks with me is number 57. So thinking about professional development and training. So that tends to be some of the audience that I'm thinking about with my research. Next slide. So the research questions that I've been focusing on in this work include: how did mainstream representations of Attawapiskat Chief Teresa Spence frame her fast? What does it mean to be in a treaty relationship today? And then what do alternative decolonial sustainable futures grounded in Attawapiskat community perspectives look like? I won't be able to answer all of those in my presentation. If you're interested, you can read the book, which doesn't have all the answers, but does provide some responses to these questions. And the image that you see here, this is a colorful image from Attawapiskat territory. And I like sharing these bright images, which are a contrast to many of the mainstream images that we had been seeing of this community around the time of Teresa Spence's fast and the I Don't Know More movement and some of the state of emergency declarations. So I try to bring a bit of that light and color into the conversation. So this is Teresa. This is the woman that I've been speaking about. And this is a image that she has granted permission to use. When I got to know her, I asked, what image would you like me to include to best reflect you? And she shared this one with me. And then I got permission from the photographer to use it in my book and presentations. So Teresa Spence was the chief of Attawapiskat, was around when there were many state of emergency declarations due to housing and all kinds of other concerns. But as a young researcher, I was quite taken with the framing of the community and a lot of the quite negative, sexist, paternalistic framing in the mainstream media, and it just really bothered me. And so that led me to, do a wider critical media analysis of the various accounts of her and her efforts, and then to try to work towards reframing. And so that's been really central to this work is how have mainstream depictions looked at her actions, and then what are some alternatives? Next slide. This is another woman that I got to know from the community, Rosie Kostachin. And so this photo is from National Indigenous Peoples Day, which is June 21st in Canada. So a number of years ago. But Rosie was the first person that I got to know personally from Attawapiskat. Teresa Spence had actually moved away during the time that I was a researcher there. And so Rosie is someone who took me around, got me to volunteer in different community events, helped with some cooking and some organizing, and really kind of showed me the ropes. And I think in any kind of relationship, it's so important that you have somebody who is willing to get to know you and to introduce you to others. So the real kind of focus of what I want to share today was about community engaged research and how that can be a method of grounded normative theory and practice. So I tend to use the phrase community engaged research, but I am quite interested in how do we ground different ideas and concepts to do that community relational work. So I'm guided by a lot of scholarship in interpretive research and critical policy studies, but also really guided by community members. And so here is a picture of a young person named Jack Linklater Jr., who at the time was an art student. And through this project, I worked really closely with the high school teacher and their art class, and we produced different films and forms of media to showcase the culture, the life, and the beauty of community members, specifically from the perspective of young people. And this turned into the Reimagining Attawapiskat project. And Jack went on and was a leader in his community's band council as well. Next slide. So here's just a mural from the classroom that was created with the art teacher and her students, just again to show you that beauty, because I think far too often many of the images that we were seeing were quite negative, a lot of blaming and framing around crisis and this, shaming the community for their own misfortunes. And so instead, I think it's really important as researchers to try to strive for some balance in that light and shadows, looking at the dark edges of colonialism and capitalism, but then also highlighting the beauty of the community as well. Next slide. Next slide. So here, this is just a snapshot from our website. So if you're interested, you can take a look. It's reimaginingattawapiskat.com. And so what we did through a series of workshops is gathered media from the young people. So photographs, artworks, digital stories, some music, for example, and all of this is online in a gallery space. And so this is part of those collecting those counter stories and trying to reframe the narrative around the community's health and well-being. So take a look at your convenience. So our team, and I should mention that I was fortunate to receive a small SSHRC Insight Development grant and work with Indigenous artists and leaders. So that was able to fund a few trips and doing these workshops. And so our team came up with this approach of mixed media storytelling. So interrogating mainstream portrayals, co-creating alternatives, and then the intervention back on mainstream discourses. And this is what we refer to as mixed media storytelling. So it's a part of that community engaged research. And it's probably the hardest part is that intervention because, where do these stories sort of sit or land? And that's what I'd love to discuss today is kind of what can you do with the stories that emerge through this kind of research. So this is just, again, a screenshot. This is Keisha. So Keisha was hired as a research assistant to work with us. And if you go to the website, you can see a video of her kind of talking about her story, who she is, and why she found value in the Reimagining Attawapiskat project. So she's one of a few other young leaders who share their story in this online digital story gallery. Here's a concluding image here. Again, Rosie, who I mentioned earlier, with some of the young people around a drum. And I really love the colorful shirt that the young person's wearing. It says good vibes. And being a non-Indigenous researcher in this space, I hear a lot about, bringing good intentions and trying to be humble and listening. And these are some values that I've learned along the way, being a non-Indigenous in this space, working with communities, trying to look at issues around violence and racism, environmental injustice. I think it's important, again, to think about listening and learning and that kind of co-creation. All of that's been really central to this approach. So I want to conclude with the words of Amy Craft, who's an Anishinaabe legal scholar, and she wrote this beautiful short book called Treaty Words, and it's really powerful. It's a children's book, but I think it carries messages for adults as well. But first, a quote from Teresa Spence, who says, "You are treaty too." And she said this to me during many interviews that we did together. And I think it's a reminder of those of us who are non-Indigenous, but I live in Canada. There are treaties, treaty relationships, and thinking really carefully about what they mean is so important. And so Amy Craft also offers some guidance in terms of a treaty not as just a contract or a historical document, but an ongoing relationship. And so this is something that, again, I don't have the answers to, but I'm committed to learning more about and to thinking really seriously about what does it mean to be in a treaty relationship today, in a Canadian context, in a colonial Canadian context. The next slide has just information for further reading or listening. There's a photo essay that I worked on before that shows some images and talks about reimagining and reframing the community. As I mentioned, my book is available. There's also a little story map linked here if you're interested, and a podcast called Pretty Heavy Stuff where I talk a bit about some of the messages in this work. I think next I have some discussion prompts, which we can circle back to if there's time. Thanks so much to our chair and facilitator today. But as I mentioned before, who should be listening to these stories? How do we make those interventions? How can stories transform policy? I feel like this is just such a challenge because so often policymakers are guided by quantitative data, and there's just something lost in translation when it comes to stories. And I'm really committed to trying to bridge that translation gap. And then finally, this big picture question, what does it mean to be in a treaty relationship today? So these are some questions that I have if we have time to discuss. Thank you so very much for listening and staying late into the night over where you are. I really appreciate it. And I'm so honored to be part of this wonderful collection. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, and as we'll see in a moment, there's a real through line between all three of your chapters around the relationality piece, the accountability, building relationships with communities. All three of you really do that in a big way. So thanks for bringing that through so vividly with those slides. All right, so now it's on to Brooke.
And really a through line with the handbook it's so funny, we have a snapshot of the handbook that is really a function of who is available in these weird time slots that we arrange. And yet, even though they're rearranged differently from how the handbook was organized, we do seem to have captured well some of the key themes. Earlier today, Young Wilkins opened us up with this idea that knowledge production is never neutral. And I think you're ending us with that thought as well. And Farah added in the previous panel that the partiality is unavoidable. You need to embrace that reality. And then Kat emphasized in her analysis of white imperialism that this is by design. It's not that we're just sort of humans that are flawed, but it's actually by design. And I think one of the cross themes from GNT scholars, grounded in engaged normative theorists, as we approach this work, is that we therefore have to attend to those in struggle, those who are struggling to be visible, those who are struggle to be heard, those who are in struggle to be comprehended. And it really means then, no matter what we're doing, whichever set of methodologies we're using, we're taking on the politics of knowledge. And there have been lots of ways of naming this and struggles that people have come to this work from doing. As Lisa mentioned this morning, for me, ones that keep coming back are Paulo Freire and Hansura Rahman and disability activists and theorists, North American Indigenous scholars, and those who use this language of grounded normativity and resurgence. Those who were active in the land back movement in the US, that's African Americans and African American feminists, the African scholars working, again, trying to ground theory in their struggle. And then for me, across that range of decolonial theorists, I just want to make sure that we don't forget that within each of those struggles, there have been feminists, whether they take that label or not, womanist or other, people who are concerned with women, girls, non-binary people, and other non-conforming people, gender non-conforming people who have been at the forefront of these struggles in their communities, for their communities, and trying to speak to larger audiences to be heard. So as more and more people start to see from a range of disciplines why this is a great way of doing research, I don't want us to forget that feminists have contributed to this field early and often across all these struggles. So my contribution to the volume does that. It tries to center the epistemic politics that feminists have always made center, even when what they're taking on is questions of structural injustice. So I do this in the piece by revealing this long history of this particular form of feminism. Not all feminists that do this, but this form of feminism has a long history. Trying to identify across that diversity of history and experience consistent key elements, and then showing in the final section of the chapter how these insights can be used for practice. So to summarize the sort of main insights, rather than review all of the parts of the piece, which fortunately the handbook publisher really invites these to be brief pieces, so they're readable. You can read a couple in a day. They're not taxing. Our authors have done a beautiful job of getting to the point really quickly. And let me see if I can do the same thing in my remaining time. So for feminists, that's always intersectional with any of the groups I've already mentioned, but always being attentive to others. And in the previous panel, Raquel Madrigal identified that as being important. Noticing when Indigenous and immigrant are not different categories, but maybe the same category in herself, but also or family's history, but also to look at those categories as always intersectional or always not connecting sometimes makes you miss. So I think one of the extra special things that the feminists are, as Farah might have alluded to or even said directly, is that we are hardworking. We are working hard to destabilize epistemic politics, and as pretty much everybody who contributes to the volume in one way or another points out, it is often an uphill battle because, as we've been talking about, in order for people to understand us, we need anybody. Right? In order for humans to be understood, we need to be speaking in terms that our interlocutors understand. And if we try to speak in terms that our interlocutors understand, we will be using their terms as well, and it will be hard for us to destabilize them. So feminists are hardworking in that respect to destabilize epistemic politics. As Audre Lorde said, it's not the quote of hers that gets the most airtime, but it is certainly one that takes up the most mental space in my mind, which is that she really wants us to treat difference and diversity as a source of strength, and not to let those who identify differences and diversity as axes of conflict to be the winners in the discussion about what we're supposed to do with our differences and our diversity of interpretation or whatnot. Fourth, we're self-consciously methodological. I think Ida B. Wells is my maybe touchstone person of this, but in the piece I also cite a Egyptian playwright and social worker psychologist and her interviews. We think about, okay, what's the best way to get through this challenge that we have faced? So Ida B. Wells has the problem of people are constructing the story of lynching in a way that doesn't make space for what she thinks is the lived experience of the people who are being accused of lynching. And so she uses all sorts of other materials, newspaper articles and reinterpretations of taking authorships of those data to get that correct, if you will, or at least alternative story out there. And Kat, in her presentation, the previous time period, was talking about that. One of the struggles we got to in the previous session was about how somebody who's doing interpretive grounded normative theory may not agree with their interlocutor. And one of the ways that feminists historically have taken this on, that challenge on, is to try to diversify. So trying to be more comprehensive in our methods, or maybe our interlocutors, destabilizing our own original methodological approach to see if we can't get into a more recursive mode rather than the self-reflective mode alone. Which gets to a fifth methodology that's consistent, which is across these feminists. Again, not every feminist, but feminist and queer scholars have been recursive and relational in their work. And we heard an example of that this morning from Paul Apostolitis in the previous section. Farah, Raquel, Vana, and Genevieve all got talking about different ways of being in relationship with the people who generate the ideas that we are theorizing around. And finally, and I think this is important, and maybe feminists are very good at making this point, is let us not erase the past work that's been done as we pursue novel approaches to figuring out how to get through these hard puzzles. Let us not assume that we are the first people who have confronted some of the methodological challenges that we've confronted. We may be, but reaching out to colleagues to figure out how to think through difficult challenges is a great strategy for entering into a more, again, relational and recursive way of problem solving. So I will stop there.
Yeah, it's a challenge because we're launching this handbook where we're trying to sort of beat the drum and say, you know, look at this. This is our brand. We're doing grounded normative theory, but the continuities and the building on these these other methodological innovations coming from all these different struggles. It's hard to do both at once. We're not inventing something, but we're building and extending. So all right, so Fauna, we'd like to hear we're going to do it is so continuous that
I'm just pinning Fauna.
Okay.
And then mute us. Thank you.
Okay. Hi. Hello, everybody. Thanks, Monique. I'm a professor of political theory at the University of California, San Diego. I've been there for 26 years, founding director of the Center on Global Justice, which is the place where Brooke and I connected. And she said, hey, by the way, you're still doing political theory. And I said, really? What kind? So that's a long conversation. But I am so honored to have been a co-editor of this beautiful handbook. And before I start, I just want to say one thing. Her camera isn't on, but Julia Corno is on with us. And Julia just defended a dissertation on disability rights in the mode of grounded normative theory at UC San Diego. And I'm extremely excited about her work and really happy that she's joining us here today. She's joining the family. Okay, so let me dive in. At some point, I'm going to share my screen, and I checked, and I think that works. So I live and work a few miles away from the child detention centers that will forever stain this period of American history. San Diego, Tijuana, where I work and live, has become a lightning rod for American nativism. In recent years, tens of thousands of Central American and Haitian migrants have waited at that wall, reviled by both sides as a nuisance or an infestation, or else they still do, in U.S. detention centers as tools of deterrence. It's been particularly devastating in recent years to witness the emotional impacts on children. their fear and the inevitable psychic internalization of being socially and morally marginalized. And climate change, we're seeing kind of a retraction right now. People are not coming north. We're actually seeing more out migration because of forced migration and self-removal. But climate change will inevitably reaccelerate northward flows in the years to come. Everybody tends to see our border region as, migration here as a function of violence and poverty, and this remains true. But climate change is a threat multiplier that makes poverty and food insecurity worse, aggravates violence, and ultimately compounds the reasons why people take the risk and leave their homes. In a recent survey, 74% of arriving migrants at the US southern border identify agricultural instability as a major factor in their decision to walk north. International agencies still refuse to characterize these people as refugees, seeing them instead as economic migrants that are drawn toward a better life. So they're not entitled to asylum or international refugee protection under the Geneva Convention. And this really will need to change in an era of accelerating climate migration. For billions of people on the planet who depend on the land and the sea, the economy and the environment are exactly the same thing. I would describe myself as a scholar activist. For more than 15 years, I've been partnering closely with UC San Diego architect Teddy Cruz. We wrote this, our chapter in the handbook together. We came together because of our interests in informality and the kind of endogenous springs of collective action in conditions of scarcity and poverty. Our work together focuses on the ingenuity and resilience of migrant populations at the border, how they assemble housing and infrastructure, markets of exchange, democratic practices, and general practices of collective survival. The border neighborhoods where we live and work are typically denigrated by formal planners and policymakers as ugly, criminal, neglected, to be avoided, to be cleaned up. But instead, through our work, we observe intensely creative urban agents who challenge the dominant paradigms of neoliberal growth that exclude them. Their everyday practices demonstrate other, more inclusive and sustainable ways of inhabiting the city. Much of this informal activity involves dense networks of cross-border cooperation, challenging racist political narratives in the United States that portray the border region as a site of criminality and dangerous undercurrents that only a border wall can stop. Borders are unrelentingly porous things: air, water, waste, health, culture, money, hope, love, justice. These things don't stop at walls. These flows and circulations shape the transgressive hybrid identities of people and everyday practices in this part of the world. So through a GNT approach, we have committed to generating productive counter-narratives about life in the border region from the bottom up. Citizenship itself, we've discovered, is a fluid, performative concept, a sense of belonging that is defined not by the nation state or the documents in your pocket, but by the shared interests and aspirations of people who inhabit a violently disrupted civic space. So border zones, are really a natural laboratory for reimagining citizenship along these lines. To carry out this work, we've developed a network of sanctuary spaces on both sides of the wall called the UCSD community stations. And here I'm going to briefly share my, okay. Can you all see it? Okay. So the community stations are physical spaces where our university and local nonprofits in their communities meet to share knowledges, nurture habits of dialogue and trust, and cultivate connected, civically engaged border communities better capable of collective action, advocacy, and productive contestation. We collaborate on participatory research, cultural and educational activities, dialogue and advocacy, and physical urban interventions, including green infrastructure, climate adaptation infrastructure, public space, and emergency housing, including now the largest refugee sanctuary in the entire US-Mexico border region, which I'll share with you in a few minutes. We're keenly attuned to power dynamics when institutions with power arrive, and we're critical of both extractive research methods and humanitarian problem-solving missions. As you all know and have experienced in your own work, academic culture is filled with vertical assumptions that we know more, that we are trained to solve the world's problems if only they would listen to us. And this kind of navel gazing is particularly harmful when a theorist or a researcher speaks, on behalf of human struggle and makes claims about people who are already marginalized, exploited, and dispossessed. We inflict a kind of double harm by assuming that our academic concepts and claims hold meaning for them. So we've committed to grounding our normative claims as well as our advocacy and interventions through horizontal practices of co-production, engaging communities as partners with knowledge and agency. Everyone contributes, everyone learns, and we do things together in the border region that no one could possibly do alone. And just to say, and we've noticed this in our work, maybe you have in yours as well, communities are justifiably skeptical of research universities who often suddenly appear with requests, plant their flag, and then disappear just as abruptly once they get what they need, kind of university projects that come and go with the wind, one-offs associated with a research project, an academic course, an internship, or a grant that ends, leaving communities feeling instrumentalized and abandoned, with challenges unmet, projects feeling half done, critical consciousness stirred perhaps, but with few outlets for meaningful follow-up or action. Oftentimes it doesn't even dawn on researchers to share their research and their publications with their community subjects. And also, because universities are big fragmented institutions, sometimes multiple projects and requests land at once without coordination or knowledge of one another, creating confusion, right, of what's what and a sense of overload. Researchers are too often reckless with the delicate social ecologies of community-based work, unaware of alliances, but also rivalries and pecking orders that often exist among nonprofits operating in conditions of scarcity. Bringing resources and opportunities to a community organization, researchers sometimes unwittingly take sides in local controversies and power dynamics and stir up trouble, the bad kind. So the community stations are, did you just see when I advanced my screen? Did it advance? Okay. So the community stations are committed to a different model. We have 4 stations, 2 in San Diego. Sorry, we have 4 stations, 2 in San Diego, 2 in Tijuana, and I want to briefly share one of them with you at the periphery of Tijuana. Let me briefly set the context. In recent years, tens of thousands of Mexican and Central American migrants have arrived at the border wall, and we're witnessing a reversal. But the shelter and the sanctuary that we've built is located in one of the peripheral canyons in Tijuana that is now home to 100,000 people. The UCSD Alacran community station that you see there in yellow is a partnership with a Christian organization, Embajadores de Jesus, that built a basic refugee camp for hundreds and over time thousands of refugees navigating asylum processes in the United States and Mexico. Several years, we joined forces to increase housing capacity. I'm sorry, wait a second. I lost my slides. Hold on one second. There we go. To increase housing capacity. The camp is built now to house 2,500 people through a combination of dormitory spaces for women and children, and then larger spaces for male residents. More than 60,000 people have now found refuge here. It's also the only shelter in the region dedicated to binational ecosystem restoration. The ecological story of this shelter is important, and I can say more later. For now, let me just say that while walls may impede people from moving back and forth, they don't impede polluted runoff, sedimentation, or habitat loss. So ecosystems have little regard for political boundaries, and the ecological catastrophe of wall building, as well as arriving migration, is devastating, actually, for the border region. The project has gained a lot of international attention in recent years. For its focus on longer-term habitation, social integration, ecological restoration, and a circular economy. Residents participate directly in shared governance and in daily operation. As I mentioned, the site contains family units, also a hydroponics farm, vocational training programs, small business incubators, and a resident-owned construction cooperative that circles income back into the community. We also convinced the state of Baja California to build a primary and elementary school on site, which is extraordinary, that we were able to receive public funding for youth migrant education. We're not replacing governments or international agencies, but we're trying to demonstrate what a scalable, community-driven alternative can look like, where, universities and the private sector get involved, partnering with public agencies to get this kind of work done. What you see here in this image is our newly completed industrial kitchen above a dining hall that sits 600 people and a civic porch for gathering and community events. At the center is little Amal, the 14-foot puppet of a Syrian refugee child who has traveled across the world and whom we recently welcomed to the site. I'm very proud to share that recently the UCSD community stations received the 2026 National Design Award from the Smithsonian National Design Museum in the category of climate action. My partner Teddy and I just received the award at the Smithsonian 2 weeks ago. And I just want to read you, I just want to close with a fragment from the citation. Located on both sides of the border wall, the stations are each co-designed and programmed with local partners to leverage university resources for climate adaptation strategies, including housing, public space, and environmental conservancy. By integrating cultural programming with scientific research and close community engagement, the stations generate actionable knowledge to address climate vulnerability and strengthen collective capacity for resilience. And let me just say, it was, let me just stop sharing. It was extraordinary to receive recognition from a federal institution right now in the United States for working on the intersection of migration and climate change. The Smithsonian selected a really extraordinary array of designers who are working, on the edges of like American poverty and structural violence and flexing their own courageous muscle against this vile administration. So we were really honored to be included among this group. Thank you. I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing. Can somebody stop?
I guess I can try to disempower you.
For some reason, I don't have a stop sharing button. It's so weird.
Hit escape on your keyboard.
Escape?
And it should pop up.
So weird. Hold on. Okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to log off and log back on really
No,
fast.
don't worry, I can cancel it, don't worry.
You
Can you do it?
We're gonna kill your slide.
I don't know why I don't see a stop share.
Real fast. And then you can unmute yourself and you can start your videos.
And Fawn is back.
Yeah, they're all there. They just have to turn their cameras
just
on.
need to
You have to open your video. For a second, it said that the meeting was locked, but you have to like.
Yeah, you can all turn your videos back on.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
If you,
If you want.
Yeah.
Here too.
Okay.
All right, so thank you, Fauna, that, and I see Sarah just discovered your website. I love watching when people realize the scale of what they're doing. It is phenomenal, yeah. So many interesting things that we could take up. There's the relationality piece, like to do the work that you want to do. All three of you have to build relationships. I mean, that's the core of what you're doing. I mean, I'm thinking of your work in Grundy County as well. But also all three of you are working in contexts where the stakes are pretty high. I mean, there are, life and death issues at stake, and it's not just an intellectual pastime that has brought you to these communities, right? That's really, the stakes are very high indeed. I'm thinking also all three of you have, maybe Sarah to a lesser extent, you perhaps, but certainly Fauna and Brooke have had to, the tools of your discipline have not been adequate to the work that you've wanted to do, and you've had to, by necessity, explore and build new methodologies and new methods, new tools. Sarah, I guess, because you work in critical policy studies and community engaged theory, there's maybe more of a simpatico relationship there, but none of you stuck narrowly to your disciplines because there's no way you could have done the work that you wanted to do. So there's lots of connections and lots to talk about. I wanted to open it up to the fairly large group that we have online for questions to any and all of the panelists. I'm not seeing any hands, but you can feel free to unmute yourself and okay, we have
to give people some time to think.
we have Ansha Wiener in the room.
Well, thank you very much. I thought, well, you almost I think you summarized the answer to my question, but I would still wanted to ask it to Brooke, because you said we are consciously methodological. And I think that's, for me, of course, as a scholar of international relations, that's kind of a non-starter. We are always methodological. I mean, you can't do anything without a methodology. But you are, of course, coming from philosophy and political theory. And so I wonder whether you wanted to explain a little bit about because, the opposite is, are you unconsciously methodological or are you not methodological? What does consciously mean?
That's a great question. Thank you for the opportunity to clarify. I would say the opposite in my usage was unconsciously methodological. Everyone is methodological, as you say. Everybody's got a discipline. Everybody's discipline's given them training. Everybody's got sort of their toolkit that they learned and maybe some adjacent tools that they've heard their colleagues learning. So they might be aware of more methods than the ones they use. But it's, the field of political science and international relations have made struggles over which kinds of methodologies are legitimate or legitimating for certain knowledge claims. And that brings us right back to the things I opened with, Jan's point about basically it's the same point. Politics of knowledge is not neutral, and it is by design. There's going to be a winner and loser and many, many losers in terms of depending on which methodologies win, other people's lived experience becomes invisible, unable to have an audience even to be considered, and now we shift to normative theory, as relevant for what it means for us to live together. And so for normative theorists, feminist normative theorists, but I don't think we are exclusive in this. For normative theorists, it's that our question is about how do we want to live together? And that can't be a solo enterprise. Answering that question has to be a political enterprise. And so we do need to be consciously methodological. Will my methodology for answering the question, how do we live together, do a good job of defining who we is so that other people agree that they are in that we about whom I am making claims about how we should live together. So yeah, for me, the opposite is you have a methodology, but you're not self-conscious about the power of that methodology to prefigure what you end up arguing or finding.
Thank you. Yeah.
Could I just add one thing to what Brooke just said? I think there's been so much enthusiasm about this handbook because I think people were doing this sort of work in conscious ways, but didn't really understand it as an organized methodology with a set of commitments and so forth. And I think that this process has helped people give language and connect with others who are doing things that might um, not have been recognizable methodologically. And I know in my case with you, Brooke, I mean, I had no you helped me understand what I was doing. I mean, I had a methodology. I was unselfconscious about it, and you helped me articulate it. And it became then linked with others who were doing very similar work. So,
Okay, I think we're going to go to Julia and then Genevieve.
Hey, thank you so much, everyone. This was super interesting, and I'm so excited to hear about everyone's work. I had a question kind of to build off of what Fauna was talking about you mentioned that this work that you've been doing across the border and in the border region was also a project of like community solutions at scale. And I mean, the scale question I think is a really interesting one because you will often hear pushback about certain community-based solutions of like, oh yeah, they might work in like these small enclaves and these small groups, but once you try to take them beyond that, they kind of fall apart. And I'm really curious to know how GNT kind of helped you conceptualize what is possible at scale, how it pushed forward, how these solutions might be implemented at scale. Um, and what it can offer in general for political theory when thinking about kind of these big, broader um, political structures that we then live under.
Hey.
I would love to hear what Sarah and Brooke have to say about it because Julia and I are in continual conversation. Thank you, Julia.
Sarah?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a few things that have been said that maybe I can try to pick up on and weave back. And first, I was thinking about the comment about how this research is like a matter of life and death, and that really stuck with me actually hearing that because as a PhD student, I was really taken by biopolitical theory, for example, and kind of have woven that into different projects. And I didn't really use that language today, but it is kind of in the back of my mind when I'm thinking about grounded theory, like how can, these high level concepts kind of guide and shape the work that we're doing when we're looking at power relations and dynamics. So yeah, just I really appreciate that comment. And then it's interesting to think about the tools of the discipline. I've kind of made it work in public admin, but conventionally public admin has been very hierarchical, very top down, very linear. And so there's this little niche of kind of like public engagement and deliberative democracy and deliberative kind of engaged studies where I sort of situate myself and find a bit of a home, but it's not quite the sort of dominant field in public admin. But nevertheless, thinking about community is so important, and that's why I'm really blown away seeing that the website and all the different examples and practices. And so I don't know if I have a good example or kind of answer about the scalability, but I think having these websites and these resources is amazing for teaching. And a lot of our students, they have to write like briefing notes and things like that for government decision makers. So our assignments are often kind of, yeah, like policy brief format. And so I'm really trying to encourage the students to look at community knowledge as evidence, as data, and put it into their notes, because so often it's quantitative studies and statistics and much more, yeah, much more quantitative research. And so I guess that's my answer for now, is that I think the more that we integrate that community knowledge into our teaching and our assignments and into that like policy intervention, I'm hopeful that policymakers will soon acknowledge that as evidence, because it's just so challenging. Even last summer, I taught a course with a government partner, the Provincial Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness, and the students were in teams, and they worked with analysts in the government to address current challenges. And I kept encouraging the students um, to have evidence based on kind of like climate survivor testimonials, but the analysts kept crossing it out like that's not evidence. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect between the knowledge that is legible to certain kinds of decision makers and community knowledge. So that's where I hope that we can bridge that gap a bit as academics, as researchers, and provide some practical guidance. And maybe that will help with the scaling up. So yeah, I'm just really grateful to see those resources, like those websites and other kind of sources of data and knowledge.
We'll go to you, Jesse.
Thank you. And again, really, really wonderful presentations. Thank you so much. So just quickly to come back to the discussion around consciously methodological. And I think that that is really hitting on something. And Fauna, I mean, I had the same kind of reactions when I, found all of you. It's like, oh yeah, my work is political theory, and there is this underlying methodology. And what is that? And so this handbook, of course, is a huge contribution. I guess it's just a little caution, a little flag to caution us, because I've seen this like in quantitative studies where the methodology then gets foregrounded and becomes fetishized. And then the work is about the methodology, and primarily about the methodology. So that just kind of was a thought I had. In addition to the methodology, there's so much other work going on. And as I listened to Sarah and Fauna and Brooke, I'm just, on the one hand, like in just total awe of the work and of the scale, and also so deeply humbled. And also just curious, like in addition to the methodology, there's a lot of emotional work, like like the stakes are really high, life and death in some cases. Um, the relationships also come with high stakes and risks. And so can you share a little bit about how you navigate, how you handle, in addition to the methodological demands, the emotional work as well?
It's, I can just say, in the recent period, in the last, 3 years or so, 2 years or so, it's been traumatic. And I raised this issue in the last session as well, that oftentimes people who are working in a GNT modality are confronting not only huge injustices on the outside, but also challenges within their own institutions and their own fields, their own universities that don't see this as political theory or as political science, who don't see this as the appropriate role for a researcher to touch the subject and pollute it, that you're getting too close, solidaristic work isn't valued. We're social workers, this sort of thing. So there's a lot of struggle, uh, formal and informal, in doing this kind of work. But I think that many of us who are doing it, I mean, that's why the work is so alive. I mean, the passion is indistinguishable from the challenges. So, yeah.
Yeah, I
Good.
love hearing you say that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember being a PhD student a number of years ago now, and I think I had finished like my first draft of my PhD dissertation, and a committee member said to me, "Your work is so emotional." And I was quite offended by that because I thought they meant that it wasn't serious or
Right.
rigorous or political science. And so it
Yeah.
really bugged me, and I didn't really know what to do with that comment. And I'm still not quite sure how it was intended, but now years later, where I've gained a little more confidence in my methodology, I've tried to reclaim it a little bit and write a bit about, sensing policy and emotions in policy. But just at the Canadian Political Science Association conference last week, someone asked me, and I think from a place of sincerity and interest, like, oh, how do you operationalize emotions in research? So I think there's an interest in understanding that, like, how do we navigate emotions? But yeah, I think of emotions in so many realms. Like one, makes me think a little bit about like how to do yeah, this community engaged research in these very charged contexts. And for me, having like a release has been important, like swimming, like swimming in lakes or swimming in rivers and with community members or by myself or whatever, just like having some like rituals of release have been so vital. So for me, swimming is one. And then trying to write in the emotions is part of it. But I'm still trying to figure out how to do that analytically and rigorously.
Yeah. What Farah said in the earlier session about writing in the first person is actually kind of cathartic, that you're actually in the story. You're part of the story. And I think that helps as well. Yeah.
To complexify the sources of motion. So one thing I do is notice when I have an adrenaline rush. I was a very bad child actor, and my teacher once said to me, because I really was shaking with fear, she's like, that just means you care. So I do think when you have that adrenaline rush, it means you care. We have obviously in our work and in my work in Grundy County, which is one of the poorest counties in Tennessee and the country, certainly have had similar kinds of concerns about emotional work related to the people who were going to be most affected, whose struggles are the ones that brought me there. But I think there's some others. Co-authorship has a big range of emotions that you get over the whole journey. Leading a team, I can think of so many things that I don't want to document in recorded context that are very difficult to have been a witness to. And you just don't have the agency in those sorts of relationships that you do if you just, I don't think I'm going to make this a question, I'm just going to make it a period, right? When you're editing your own work, that's not really comparison. I mean, you have total power over that word. And in your relationships with your teams, you just don't, or they don't get along with each other. And that wasn't my core competency. So in both contexts, like incredible witness to incredible abuse of authority and hierarchy, even within my teams. So I just think it's important to acknowledge that what we anticipate as being the set of experiences that will create emotional work. One of the things that makes it so emotional is that you weren't prepped for it. Like you knew when you were working at the border, you were going to witness people who were migrants and in struggle.
Yeah, I just also wanted to add like the precarity of the academic job market and not being able, I mean, like to do community engaged research that is place-based in the place that you live and to have trusting long-term relationships means that you live somewhere for a long period of time. And so I just want to also add, like, just thinking about the stage of the researcher with grounded normative theory and what's actually possible, I think is really important to like put on the table as well. And access, I mean, coming from a small liberal arts college, access also to university funding and research funding is a site of like unevenness, I guess, within the different scholars that are working on this. But I have a question, if I can ask.
I think we're actually over time at this point, so maybe we will pick that up tomorrow morning. Okay. So everyone, we are at time. Thank you for your fantastic presentations. I also wanted to close by thanking, although we will do this again tomorrow, but the institute that's hosting us, the Hamburg Institute for Advanced Study, and in particular, Christian, Elena, Astrid, Tanya, and especially Sonia, who's made this possible. So, just to note that a lot of people put a lot of work into making this conversation happen. And hopefully we'll see those of you for whom it's not the middle of the night. We'll see many of you tomorrow morning, our morning for the final panel. So thanks, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This is awesome. Bye.